So the project, as several people have mentioned, I think particularly Jen mentioned that there's a lack of people with expertise in Minnesota working on bats. So while our main focus was to develop methods for studying summer habitat, because as Mark suggested, we're concerned that this April 1st to September 30th period is too broad, that hopefully we can narrow the type of forest or type of species that females are using for maternity colonies during that period, that we hopefully can narrow. So there's a variety of things that we hope we can learn about summer roost habitat to help the Fish and Wildlife Service narrow that preliminary prescription that they put out last winter. So that's the main goal of the project. And we wanted to test the methods in 2 different parts of the state. So because we had good partners in the Camp Ripley, which I know this is oversimplified, but it is somewhat oak dominated, and Superior National Forest, at least the portion that we worked in, somewhat aspen dominated. We picked those 2 areas. And before I actually go any further, I want to acknowledge Tim Catton here with the Superior National Forest, who actually ran the field portion of the project. And so if I wasn't kind of coordinating the project, he'd be up here giving this talk. And Brian Dirks with Camp Ripley, who was a critical partner in the Camp Ripley of the project. Carrie Kirschbaum, who was very involved, and several other people in the audience who also participated in the project. The third objective was, as I mentioned, just to build some expertise, get people out there handling bats, netting bats, so that when the bat gets listed, we'll have more people who know how to study bats, because we really have not had a lot of people who have had experience with bats previous to this year. And then finally, back to my first point, to begin to think about while the northern long-eared bat is a relatively common species in Minnesota, let's learn what we can about what its habitat requirements are, what its behavior is, so that if and when it does decline due to white nose syndrome, we'll be able to develop some effective methods for mitigating any impacts that might occur on down the road. So our methods were first to go to the 2 sites that we were interested in, and this was work that Brian and Tim mainly took on, reconnaissance to select the netting sites that we used. We ended up working in really 2 parts of Camp Ripley, a northern area and a southern area, three sites down there and 4 sites up there. And then 3 clusters within Superior National Forest, 1 right near Isabella, 1 south of Ely, and 1 north, in an area north of Ely, for a total of 12 sites. So at those sites, we worked to capture female northern long-eareds. The methods you've now seen, this is another picture of a net that you can't see because it's a mist net. But there's 1 pole there, and there's the other pole there, and there's a net suspended between those 2 poles. And as with the Enbridge project and the Aitkin County project, we mostly worked in open corridors, but as Tim mentioned in passing, there is increasing evidence that there are as many bats flying through the forest as there are flying in these corridors. One thing that has us wondering is if our sampling of the corridors is biased in any way, if we would be getting a different set of bats if we were netting equally within the forest as we are in these more open corridors, roads, trails, creeks, along shorelines and things like that. There's a captured bat. You've seen other pictures, and I don't want to repeat too much of what you've already heard. So, oops, I guess I can't go backwards, huh? So we had 15 radios, and so our goal was to, again, as a pilot, small sample size, but was to put radios on up to 15 female northern long-eared bats. You've now seen these pictures before. Here's some radios in their case, and there's a radio, and if you look very carefully, you can see the antenna extending out behind that bat. And then follow the bats, as you've now heard several times, to roost sites, quantify the emergence activity at those roost sites, and to characterize the physical characteristics of the roost sites. So let me talk about results. So we captured a total of, I can't remember the number. What is that? 86. Yes, 86 plus 44, 130 bats. Predominantly little browns at Camp Ripley and predominantly northerns at the Superior. We caught 6 of the state's 7 bat species. Just one hoary bat and very few, I think 3 silver-eared, but larger numbers of the other 4. We also collected acoustic data at each of the net sites. So here's a typical configuration where the nets are the triangles, those 3 triangles, and then acoustic monitoring in these circles, and then this is the central site where we worked up bats. Not all bats detected acoustically were captured, and so we know that we weren't capturing everything that was there, and we're still analyzing the acoustic data. Tim already showed a picture like this, and this is something that Tim Catton provided to me, and if we can, there's actually a little, if we can click that, you see that little icon in the bottom, it's going to trigger the sound that is this very sonogram. So you can get, did you count how many were in? Multiple little browns. Just to get an idea. So that's that image. Just to give you an idea of what we're working with. Okay. So, okay. So that, just a taste of what we're working with. Whoops. Okay. Can you undo that? Thank you. As far as banding, we banded 90, we put bands on 93 of the bats. We put transmitters on 15 of them, as I said. We put transmitters on 12 of the northern long-eareds, plus 3 of the little browns. Oh, geez, I'm pressing the wrong button. Sorry about that. So the bats were relocated 77 times, 33 roost structures. Again, similar to the other reports, we found that bats were using multiple roost structures and that they ranged up to 1.5 miles from the nets to the roost structures. So here's beginning to give you an idea of what we found. The roost structures, you know, they're a reflection of what the forest looks like. This is not a random sample of roost structures, nor did we take random samples away from the roost structures to see what the forest is composed of. So this is a non-random sample. It is what we found, but it can't be used to infer beyond the sample itself. So in the Superior, because the Superior is dominated by aspen, we found predominantly aspen. At Camp Ripley, we found predominantly roost structures in red oak, but we did find a variety of other species as well. So aggregating the two sites together, about half were in aspen, 21% in red oak and the other species. And there was a question about live versus dead. Here's the summary here. 26 of the 33 were live, 7 of the 33 were dead. Most of the aspen were live, about half of the oak were live. Again, a non-random sample. You know, we didn't place these sites randomly, but this is what we found. As far as size, you can see the DBH wide-ranging at Camp Ripley with a mean of 18 inches for the aspen, 15 inches for the oak, which again was the dominant species. And in the Superior, a mean of 13 inches for the aspen. So generally large, and this does, you know, help us to get at the question of this 3-inch, anything over 3 inches that the Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed may be too low, too small for us to be concerned about. Emergence surveys, we did have access to night vision equipment at Camp Ripley. There's a tree and a bat. Is this actually a bat emerging from a tree? It's just a tree at night. Okay. But similar to the findings that you've heard elsewhere, a variety, a fairly substantial number of bats emerging from many of the trees, though in some cases, relatively small numbers. So roost site analysis we're still analyzing. We collected relevaes at the sites on the roost trees on the Superior National Forest, but I didn't want to disappoint you. So last night, literally during the commercial breaks, I put together this slide. So it's very preliminary, and this is hot off the presses. But what this is for the roost sites in the Superior National Forest. We did some rough analysis by height class. So we had a 2 to 5 meter height class, and then because of the way the data was collected, I don't have it. They aren't exclusive height classes. Here's a 2 to 10, a 10, a 10 to 20, over 20. But I think, and also, this isn't mean and range. I did that wrong because, as I say, I was rushing and it was 10 o'clock at night and the game was almost over. But this is mean and variance. But I think what's interesting here are these two very broad conclusions. Again, not a random sample. Let's not assume that this is true. But what we've been hearing about northern long-eared bats are words like a clustered forest. We've heard that several times. We've heard about a suppressed subcanopy. And these things kind of stand to reason because both the clustered forest and the suppressed subcanopy tend to create dead material in the subcanopy. You know, self-pruning, self-thinning. So you get places where bats are going to roost. And I have to say that at least in a very gross sense, this kind of supports that. Not a lot of canopy in a wide range of subcanopies. Very unselective, this bat seems to be based on this very small sample. But this is the data we have right now. We also did some other things cooperatively while we were out there. We took wing punches and swab samples for white nose syndrome for a microbiome study that's going on and a genetic analysis, all for the Forest Service lab in Rhineland, Wisconsin. And we also took hair samples where, you know, because you have to shave the hair off when you put a transmitter on a bat, we collected those hair samples and they went to UW La Crosse for some mercury work that they're doing. And as I said, we had lots of cooperative sponsors. This project, you know, when the interim guidance came out, it immediately became apparent that we needed more information. And so the first place I went to was actually, to their credit, I went back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and I said, you know, we need to do some research here. And they gave me the $20,000 in seed money that started this project. So credit to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They recognized the need and were willing to support the need. My own division at the DNR, Division of Ecological and Water Resources, we probably put $60,000 into the project. I've never asked for an estimate from the Superior National Forest, but I'm sure they put probably another $50,000, $60,000 into the project. Camp Ripley put a huge amount of money in. Our divisions of Forestry, our division of Parks put $10,000 in. Forestry put $5,500 in. Our Fish and Wildlife Division put another $5,000 in. So this was a very much of a cooperative project with lots of contributors. And then all these other entities that helped in one way or another. We had lots, what did we count, 44 different participants in the end, something like that. And so this was a very much of a cooperative project. And so I want to make sure that everyone realizes putting something like this on is hard and takes a lot of cooperators to get it done. So, given that, we need to complete the analysis and get a report out. We've got a preliminary report. I can provide the preliminary report, but I'll be continuing to do this roost site analysis, and so we'll be modifying the report and the acoustic data as we go, so we'll be learning more. But get in touch with me if you want to get a copy of that report. And then we have the Minnesota Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota's Resources. LCCMR gives out money for research and natural resource work. We got a preliminary commitment for $1.25 million to enlarge this project. It will require approval of next year's legislature, but if that gets approved, it's going to be a much expanded effort to do something similar to what we've done. There will be 4 different phases of this project. The first will be to gather up all the data that we have on northern long-eared bat, where we know it has occurred, and to analyze those data. The second will be to fill the gaps where we don't have adequate bat data in the state. We will conduct acoustic surveys throughout the rest of the state to get a full picture of where which species of bats are in the state. And then to take a truly stratified random sample of those places where we have evidence that northern long-eared bats are, and to do a much more extensive netting effort. And we're thinking in order of 140 transmitters, and this is Minnesota alone, over the next 3 years. And then identify roost sites and characterize those roost sites using much more refined methodology of what I've just shown you now. So that's what we did this summer, what we're hoping to do. The last thing I'll mention is that in addition to trying to expand the research on this species, we've also been working with other states to respond to the Fish and Wildlife Service's proposal. Is Lisa here yet? We're going to have a Fish and Wildlife Service representative this afternoon, so I don't want to step on her toes, but I will tell you that, and as you probably know, the proposal that was published last October was to list northern long-eared bat as an endangered species. That decision was originally due this October, earlier this month, and then that decision was postponed until next April, largely at the request of the states. The states also said that we were concerned about the interim guidance that had been issued, and that we wanted to be more involved. The states subsequently put together a meeting of the states that are within the range of northern long-eared bat. We held that earlier this month in Minneapolis. We had about 100 people from 24 states come to that workshop, in which we gathered up whatever additional information we have, such as the research we did. Tim came and talked about the research that he did this summer. We heard from several other states about research that they had been doing. And then the idea was to bring together that new information and to formulate a comment letter back to the Fish and Wildlife Service saying that, is that about time limit? Oh, okay. Comment letter to the Fish and Wildlife Service, which we are finalizing. That comment letter will be going to the Fish and Wildlife Service on November 5th, next week. And that will be signed, it looks like it will be signed by the, there is an association of fish and wildlife agencies that's nationwide. That association has 3 chapters within the range of the northern long-eared bat, the Midwest Association, Northeast, and Southeast. Those 3 associations, it looks like, are going to sign this letter, as well as 2 associations of state foresters, the northern area and the southern area. So my prediction is that we'll see, next week whether this happens, but I believe that we will have those 5 associations signing this letter, and that the letter, no secret, will recommend a threatened rather than, or will actually, the letter will say it shouldn't be listed as endangered. It's going to remain, it may remain silent ultimately as to whether it should be listed as threatened, but the intended implication is that it's unlikely not to be listed at all, so the other alternative is a threatened determination. And if there is a threatened determination, we're strongly encouraging that the Fish and Wildlife Service exercise its authority to promulgate a rule called a 4D rule, which would allow them to exempt certain activities which are beneficial to the species from the prohibition against take. And we've particularly targeted forest management as an activity that we believe is that the management of forest is beneficial to the species, and so it should be exempted from the take that might result from that beneficial activity. So that letter will be released, it'll be finalized next week, and it'll be released, and I'm sure you'll be seeing copies of it. It'll be well circulated. The intent of the Fish and Wildlife Service is to open a comment period. I was at a meeting with the regional office staff earlier this week in Iowa, and I was told that comment period is likely to open mid-November, like November 15th, and be open for 30 days. So it is my hopes that the organizations that you folks represent will submit comments in support of the new information that is in that letter. And the reason I say it that way is the Fish and Wildlife Service won't be swayed by comments that say, we agree with this letter. They'll be swayed by comments that say, we agree with the information and the arguments that were posed in this letter. That it isn't just a sign-on letter, it is a letter of new information and contentions that we hope will influence the decision of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So, with that, yeah, Greg.
Yeah, Rich. Can you explain just a little bit about how important the funding for LCCMR funding is in relation to developing the habitat conservation plan?
Well, and you know, there's something else I should mention. Thanks. Okay, Greg asked the relationship between the funding, the LCCMR funding, and a habitat conservation plan. One of the provisions of the Federal Endangered Species Act is that if a species is listed as endangered, as is proposed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, that the only way to get permission to take the species is by receiving an incidental take permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And in turn, the only way to receive an incidental take permit is to apply for one, and an application has to include what's called the Habitat Conservation Plan. And the Habitat Conservation Plan is a very complicated document that sometimes takes years to develop. So this isn't a quick fix, but the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan applied for and received a $1 million grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service, what's called a planning grant, to develop a habitat conservation plan for forest-dwelling bats. So we have received that grant, and right now we're holding off on deciding how we're going to pursue, how we're going to actually implement that. Chances are it will be mostly done through contract with a consultant to do most of the work. But a portion of it will be used, the portion of that grant will be used by Wisconsin and Michigan to do research similar to the research I've described that we'll be doing, and a portion of it will come to Minnesota that will mostly be used to help support partnerships with stakeholders like yourselves in developing that habitat conservation plan. So that planning grant will be getting moving on probably once the decision is made. Because if a threatened determination is made, it may change how we approach how we use that money than if it comes out as endangered. Yeah.
Will the state letter be specific as to which forestry management practices are viewed as positive?
The question is if the state letter is specific as to which forestry management practices are positive and why. We went around and round on that one. And in the end, we decided not to be specific about forest management practices. And that was a strategic decision that we felt that if we were specific as far as which forest management practices were beneficial, that we were concerned, there was concern that Fish and Wildlife Service would focus too narrowly on those practices and hold us to those practices too aggressively. So it's what we implied in the letter was that we should be involved in developing those practices on down the road, but that we weren't specific about them in the letter. Yeah.
It seems to me that it's pretty, I was pleased to hear that, I don't know, Rich, if you can go back to the slide that has the LCCMR activities for the funding.
Last slide.
I just was thinking of, you see these numbers by these first People grab these numbers and come up with their own conclusions, but what's the timeline on these 4 activities as far as 10 years?
No, this is a 3-year grant, and the first one, we actually may, we'll start the first one next year, but we may actually get into the second one and the third one next year as well. And because there's going to be so much work that needs to get done as far as acoustic surveys and netting, especially if we have 140 radios to mount and to track. Tracking those radios is very personnel intensive. So we will probably spread that over 3 years as well. And actually, it's interesting because the LCCMR, sometimes they after they grant a project, they'll say, but be sure to attend to this. So in our case, they said, be sure that your sampling reflects forest management in Minnesota. And so we are going to be careful to stratify our samples so that it reflects the kind of forest management that goes on in Minnesota, so that it isn't just a random sample of all forests in Minnesota, but so that it's stratified to reflect the different kinds of forest management that happens within that forest. Mark. Yeah, we won't bias, it'll be all lands that we'll be studying. Yeah. Well, depending, but okay, the question is, other bats are going to be affected by white nose syndrome, especially little brown bat. In the east has clearly been affected by white nose syndrome. And are we going to have to do this all over again? Well, the question, I guess, depending on what you mean by this, the big picture issue of listing, chances are, if little brown bat gets affected as severely as northern long-ear has, it will get proposed for listing too. And yes, we will have to do the same thing that we're doing for northern long-ear for little brown bat. So yes to that. As far as this research is concerned, the acoustic, the second activity, we're going to be gathering data on all the bats, so we'll have the data on all the species. But in order to get at the question that's most pressing right now, we are going to focus the third and fourth activity on northern long-eared, and if we have to do the same for little brown on down the road, we may have to do it separately. Yeah. Yeah.
So you started this talk by mentioning the desire to do this work while we still have quite a few bats to work with. Do you have any guess, based on what's happened elsewhere, how long before we don't have quite a few bats to work with?
The question is how quickly will white nose syndrome affect our bats? Well, when you see the letter, one of our contentions is that we believe that the Fish and Wildlife Service's prediction that white nose is going to hit everywhere soon is not well-founded. So we are not sure how quickly. And actually, I promised Ed Quinn with our Division of Parks, that I would mention that, and this is a mistake that I've made, and Tim mentioned this, the discovery of white nose syndrome in Minnesota is probable, but not certain. The fungus was detected in 2012, was it, Ed?
2011, 2012 winter, 2012-13 winter.
But was not detected in 2013-2014 winter. So there's always chance of false positives. It's likely that it'll make it here. I mean, infected bats have been found in Wisconsin and Michigan, so it's coming. But to what degree, how quickly, whether the impact will be the same that it was in the northeastern U.S. is completely conjectural. There's lots of, and we go into this in great detail in the letter, There's evidence that spread of the disease is a function of density of the bats. Bat colonies are less dense in the west and in the south. There may be some degree of difference as far as, for example, in the south, where, as Tim described, bats are aroused from their torpor by, it's not the disease that kills them, it's the arousal that kills them. But in some parts of their range, there may actually be insects and water that they can replenish themselves with in the winter. So that wouldn't be in the case in Minnesota, most certainly, but it may spread more slowly as it moves west. There may be refugia, that is areas where the different species will survive better than elsewhere. There's some evidence of a very slow recovery occurring in the east. There's some evidence of a behavioral response in the east where bats are going into hibernation more beefed up than they used to. They're actually heavier. So, you know, there's all kinds of possibilities that exist, so we don't know how quickly or if it will impact Minnesota bats the way it has New England bats. Yeah.
Is part of that question dependent on the nature of the winter hibernaculum? And it sounds like from what I got out of reading the draft of that letter that there's a possibility there's more dispersed hibernacula than are generally understood. And if that's the case, is there a need to do more winter surveys as well, or is there a practical reason why that's difficult?
So the question is, might there be more hibernacula, and if there might be, is there need for more surveys of winter hibernacula? And I think most certainly, as I mentioned earlier, there are more hibernacula than we know about, and than any state knows about. And the reason we don't know more about them is because it's next to impossible to find them. Radios don't last long enough for us to put a radio on them when they're most easily caught, say coming out of hibernacula, and to follow them back all the way through the summer, and our ability to find roost sites is very limited. And even if we put a radio on a bat out of a roost site, it won't last long enough to be followed to hibernacula. Now, bats do swarm before they hibernate. So one idea that I've been discussing with others, Tim, you may have some ideas on this, is to do a better job of identifying swarms. And there's some interesting approaches to identifying swarms, because if we could identify swarms that were not outside of mines and caves, maybe we'd find other places. Maybe there are swarms that exist outside of talus slopes or at cliff faces or other alternative sites. But how do you find these swarms? One interesting tool that I heard about at a talk yesterday is the use of radar that has been used to study birds for quite a while now, starting to be used to study bats. And of course, it's best to identify aggregations of animals in the air. So maybe the trouble is swarms are not quite as easily identified as migrating birds. But so the big question is, how do we find those alternative hibernacula? It's not an easy thing to do, or it would have been done. Other questions?
The causes of the white nose syndrome, is the study finding that they're more apt to show up in certain types of caves? I mean, the abandoned iron ore mine's got to be a lot different than the mystery cave down in southern Minnesota. One more susceptible than another.
There's a lot of work going on white nose syndrome. A lot of work studying where it occurs, where it's more prevalent, how to slow it down, how to fight it. So far, I haven't heard anything that identifies different characteristics of caves themselves, although there's some interesting research going on studying other fungi that are present in caves, and to see if another fungus might be used to suppress the activity of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. There's experiments going on with distilling volatile organic chemicals from those other fungi and putting them on the bats that are susceptible to white nose syndrome. There's obvious things like decontaminating people that go in and out of bat caves. There's millions of dollars being spent on studying white nose, but nothing quite in that angle that I've heard of yet.